A 23-year-old virgin was exchanged for a debt by her own father and sent into a forced marriage. Before going into the video, please leave us a like and a subscribe so we have the motivation to make the next videos. Serafina Lockwood had never known freedom. Born into the world of wealth, power, and carefully curated perfection, she had been raised to be an ornament, an extension of her family's legacy, rather than an individual with her own dreams and desires. Her father, Senator Charles Lockwood, had always dictated the terms of her existence. Every lesson, every dinner party, every social engagement was meticulously planned to shape her into the perfect lady, the flawless daughter, the ideal wife-in-waiting. And Serafina had obeyed. Not because she wanted to, but because she had never been given the choice to do otherwise. The Lockwood estate was a palace, a symbol of grandeur and old money influence. Yet to Serafina, it had always felt more like a gilded cage. The towering walls were not built to keep threats out, but to keep her in. The lavish halls, the sparkling chandeliers, the perfectly manicured gardens, everything was beautiful, yet suffocating. She had never stepped outside alone, never wandered without a purpose determined by someone else. Her future had been written in ink before she had even learned how to read. At 23, she had never been kissed, never felt the thrill of an unscripted moment, never tasted rebellion. While other young women dreamed of love, adventure, and passion, Serafina had been taught to dream of security, duty, and propriety. But what kind of dream was it if she had no say in it? She had accepted it all, the rules, the restrictions, the expectations. She had told herself that this was what it meant to be born into privilege, that this was her role in the world. But deep inside, buried beneath layers of duty and decorum, a quiet yearning had always flickered, a longing for something more, though she had never dared to define what more truly meant. Then one evening, everything changed. Her father entered her room unannounced, something he never did. His usual mask of composure was cracked, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. Serafina knew before he even spoke that whatever he was about to say would alter her life forever. "You're getting married, yeah," he said, his voice hollow, almost reluctant. "We have no choice." Serafina felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The words echoed in her mind, heavy, suffocating, final, married. The very thing she had been groomed for all her life. The thing she had been told was her purpose, her duty, and yet, in this moment, it felt like a sentence being passed rather than a milestone to be celebrated. "To whom?" she asked, her voice calm, though her fingers dug into the silk of her dress. Her father hesitated. "Lucian Thorne." The name sent a chill through her. She had heard of Lucian Thorne, everyone had, a man with a reputation as ruthless as it was legendary. A businessman who made kings bow, whose name carried weight heavier than any title. He was known for his power, his wealth, and most of all, his lack of mercy. "He's agreed, her father continued, his voice burning. "The wedding is set for this weekend." Serafina's pulse pounded in her ears. "So soon?" Her father exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "He's made it clear that waiting isn't an option." Her stomach twisted. "You mean he's given you no choice?" A long silence stretched between them. And then, for the first time in her life, she saw something she had never seen before in her father's eyes. Fear. The realization hit her like a blow. This wasn't just a marriage. This wasn't just politics or alliances. This was survival. Her father had lost everything. The empire he had built. The name he had protected for decades. It was all crumbling. And Serafina was the last asset he had left to bargain with. She wasn't being given away. She was being sold. A cold numbness spread through her. She should have fought back, should have screamed, begged, pleaded. But there was no point. She had always known her life was not her own, but until this moment, she had never understood how truly powerless she was. That night, she sat in front of the mirror in her vast, empty room, staring at her reflection. The girl looking back at her was flawless, a porcelain doll sculpted to be admired, never touched, never truly alive. Lucian Thorne would own her in just a few days, and no one, not even herself, could stop it. The morning of the wedding arrived like a shadow consuming the last remnants of light. There were no grand celebrations, no extravagant displays of romance. The Lockwoods had once been a family of influence, but now they were a family of desperation. The wedding was a transaction, A cold, calculated deal signed in ink and sealed with the weight of inevitability. Serafina wore a dress chosen for her, walked down an aisle she had not agreed to, and spoke vows that felt like chains fastening around her soul. She did not cry. She did not tremble. She simply ceased to exist. Serafina Lockwood became Serafina Thorne that day, but in truth, she became nothing at all. As she was led into a sleek black car, the reality of her fate sank in. The towering estate awaiting her was more prison than home, its stone walls looming beneath the night sky like an unmovable force. And inside, waiting for her, was the man who now owned her, Lucian Thorne. The moment she stepped inside, she felt his presence before she even saw him. The weight of his gaze, sharp and assessing, made her skin prickle. When he finally spoke, his voice was smooth, deep, carrying a quiet command that sent shivers down her spine. "Did you really think you'd sleep alone tonight?" Serafina's breath hitched. Instinctively, she took a step back, only for her spine to meet the unyielding coldness of the wall. Lucian moved toward her, slow and deliberate, his every step a promise of something dark and inescapable. "You're my wife now," he murmured, tilting his head slightly, watching her the way a predator watches prey. "And I always take what's mine." A single thought pulsed through Serafina's mind as she met his piercing gaze. "I was never free, and now I never will be." But beneath the fear, beneath the resignation, there was something else, a flicker of something she had never allowed herself to feel before, something dangerously close to defiance. Serafina Lockwood had known her fate the moment her father uttered those cursed words, "You're getting married." She had spent her entire life preparing for a marriage arranged by power, but she had never imagined it would feel like an execution. And yet, here she was, dressed in white, standing before a man whose name alone sent shivers down the spines of men twice his age. Lucian Thorne. His name was whispered in elite circles with a mixture of awe and fear. He was not a politician, not a nobleman. He was a king in his own right, one who built empires with ruthless ambition and crushed those who dared to challenge him. He was powerful, feared, untouchable. And now he was hers. No, she was his. As she stood at the altar, the weight of inevitability pressed down on her. The grand cathedral was filled with people, but she had never felt more alone. The air was heavy with silent judgment, with hushed whispers of scandal and speculation. Everyone knew the truth. This was not a wedding, but a business deal, a transaction between two men. Her father had lost everything. The Lockwood name, once untouchable, had crumbled under the weight of his debts and political missteps. His so-called allies had abandoned him, and his enemies had closed in like wolves. In the end, his last bargaining chip had been her. Lucian had not come to the Lockwoods as a suitor. He had come as a collector, as a man claiming what was now his by right. There had been no courtship, no stolen glances or whispered promises, just a contract, ink drying on the paper, sealing her fate before she had even spoken a word. Her hands trembled as she lifted her gaze to meet his. Lucian stood tall, composed, the embodiment of calculated dominance. He wore power as effortlessly as his tailored black suit. His features were sharp, chiseled jaw, piercing gray eyes, lips that never curled into a true smile. If he felt anything about this arrangement, he did not show it. Cold, unreadable. He did not reach for her hand when she hesitated. He simply waited, a silent demand, a warning that resistance was futile, and so she said the words that bound her to him forever. "I do." The moment the vows were spoken, applause echoed through the cathedral, hollow, meaningless noise that did not belong in a place where love was supposed to exist. Lucian slipped a ring onto her finger. The metal was cold. So was his touch. The priest pronounced them husband and wife, and with that, Serafina Lockwood ceased to exist. She was Serafina Thorne now, a possession. The ride to Lucian's estate was silent. Serafina sat rigidly in the back of the sleek black car, staring out the tinted windows at the blur of city lights. The ring on her finger felt heavier than it should, a constant reminder of the chain she could never remove. Lucian sat beside her, his presence overwhelming despite the distance between them. He had barely looked at her since the ceremony, but she felt his gaze now, cool, assessing, as if he were studying a piece of art he had just acquired. It made her skin prickle. Finally, she turned to him, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Is that all I am to you? A business deal? Lucian did not react immediately. Then he exhaled, the sound slow and deliberate. You tell me, he murmured, his tone unreadable. Are you something more? Serafina clenched her fists, hating the way his words made her feel as if she were the one without power, the one grasping for control. The car slowed as they approached the gates of the Thorne estate, a towering fortress of stone and glass, elegant yet imposing, much like the man who owned it. The moment the car stopped, Lucian stepped out first, offering his hand. She hesitated. For a brief moment, the weight of her new reality crushed her. She had never stepped anywhere without permission, without guidance. And yet, this was different. This was final. She could refuse his hand. She could run. But where? Her father had sold her to the highest bidder. There was no home left for her to return to, no place where she belonged. So with a deep breath, Serafina placed her hand in his. Lucian's fingers closed around hers, firm but not cruel. Yet as he led her inside, she could not shake the feeling that she had just stepped into a prison where the walls were invisible and the warden never left. The doors closed behind them with a resounding thud. Lucian did not let go of her hand. Instead, he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. You're mine now, Serafina, he said, his voice low, final. You belong to me. Her heart pounded, her pulse wild. Lucian tilted his head slightly, watching her, waiting. Then he lifted her hand, her left hand, trailing his thumb slowly over the ring he had placed there. Did you really think I would let my wife sleep alone tonight? Serafina's breath caught. Lucian's grip was light, but his presence was suffocating. There was no escape from him. From this, and in that moment, she understood. It didn't matter that she had been raised to be perfect. It didn't matter that she had once believed marriage was supposed to be sacred. Lucian Thorne was not a husband. He was a force, a storm that would consume everything in his path, including her. What happens next? Can Serafina fight against the man who now owns her? Or will she discover that sometimes, even in the darkest prisons, something unexpected can grow? Comment below if you want to see Serafina break free, or if you believe she can tame the storm that is Lucian Thorne. Like this story if you believe in strength even in the face of fate, and subscribe to the channel for more dramatic and emotional stories. The real battle has only begun. Serafina Lockwood had always known her wedding would not be filled with love. She had never expected soft whispers, stolen glances, or the kind of affection she had read about in secret, hidden between the pages of books she was never supposed to own. But she had, at the very least, expected dignity, a semblance of grace. Instead, her wedding felt like an execution. There were no flowers, no laughter, no celebration. Only a deal, finalized in hushed voices, as her father and Lucian Thorne exchanged quiet words before the ceremony began. She stood at the altar, numb, wearing a dress she had not chosen, speaking vows she did not believe in. Her lips formed the words, I do, though her heart was screaming no. Lucian slipped the ring onto her trembling finger, his touch cool, impersonal. He did not smile, did not whisper sweet words. He only nodded once, satisfied with the completion of their arrangement. And just like that, she was his. The moment the ceremony ended, she was ushered into a sleek black car. No farewell from her father. No final embrace from the family that had just sold her away. She was alone, seated beside a man whose presence filled every inch of space around her. Lucian did not look at her, but his control over the situation was absolute. He was the storm, and she was merely caught in the winds of his making. Serafina clenched her hands together in her lap, watching the city lights blur past the window. The silence between them was suffocating, stretching endlessly until she could no longer bear it. Is this how it's going to be? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucian turned his head slightly, finally acknowledging her. What is going to be? This, she gestured to the space between them, to the entire night that had unfolded like a transaction rather than a union. This marriage. Lucian exhaled slowly, studying her with an intensity that made her shiver. Would you prefer I lie to you, Serafina? Would you rather I play the devoted husband, hold your hand, tell you stories of how we will grow to love each other? Her throat tightened. You're a cruel man. He smirked, the corner of his lips curving in a way that did not reach his eyes. I am an honest one. The car came to a slow stop, and Serafina turned her gaze to the grand estate that loomed before them. It was a fortress of glass and steel, elegant yet cold, a place that felt more like a prison than a home. Her chest ached as she stepped out, the weight of her circumstances pressing down on her. She was led through the marble halls by silent attendants, each glance they stole at her filled with curiosity and knowing. The new wife. When they reached the master bedroom, her stomach twisted. The room was vast, the bed an imposing centerpiece in a space that felt suffocating despite its grandeur. The door clicked shut behind her, and she was alone, or so she thought. The sound of approaching footsteps sent a sharp jolt through her. Lucian entered, his presence filling the room before he even spoke. He shrugged off his jacket, loosened his tie, movement slow, deliberate. He watched her, his gaze never wavering, drinking in the sight of her standing there, rigid, afraid. Serafina took a step back, but there was nowhere to go. His voice, when he spoke, was smooth, measured. "Did you really think you would sleep alone tonight?" Her breath caught in her throat. Lucian moved closer, his every step sending her pulse into a frantic rhythm. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the strap of her dress, tracing the delicate fabric before slipping it off her shoulder. Serafina flinched, her entire body tensing. "Don't," she whispered, barely able to push the word past her lips. Lucian tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharp, unreadable. "You're my wife, Serafina. That is what you were raised for, isn't it?" Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Lucian's touch was not gentle, but neither was it violent. It was possessive, a reminder of what she had become, a thorn. And that night, in the silence of a room far too vast and far too cold, he took what had been promised to him. Serafina lay motionless beneath the weight of her new reality, staring at the ceiling long after Lucian had fallen asleep. She had been given away like a piece of property, taken like she had no voice, no say. But what unsettled her most, what truly sent ice through her veins, was not that she had been claimed. It was that she had not fought him, not truly. She had not screamed, had not begged, had not done anything but tremble in his grasp, her body betraying the battle raging in her heart. She hated him with every fiber of her being, and yet she hated herself more. Morning light seeped through the curtains, casting golden hues over Serafina's bare skin. She lay motionless, her mind trapped between exhaustion and quiet despair. The scent of Lucian lingered on the sheets, on her body. No matter how much she wished to scrub it away, she knew it was now a part of her. The door creaked open, and she turned her head slightly, her body stiffening as Lucian entered. His hair was damp from a shower, his crisp black shirt open at the collar, exposing the hard lines of his chest. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, his gaze searching. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his voice low, teasing. Serafina clenched the sheets around her, her voice trembling with anger. "You forced me." Lucian chuckled, a dark, knowing sound. He moved closer, slow, deliberate, watching her the way a predator watches prey. "Forced?" he repeated, leaning down, his face inches from hers. "Don't lie to me, Serafina." Her breath hitched as his fingers traced her jaw, as his lips brushed against her ear. "You moaned under me, welcomed me." His voice was a whisper now, sinful, taunting, more than once. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She wanted to deny it, wanted to push him away, to claw at his face, to scream. But the most terrifying truth of all was that she couldn't. Lucian leaned back, satisfied with her silence. "I don't need your words, Serafina. Your body speaks louder than your lips ever could." With that, he stood, adjusting his cuffs as though nothing had happened, as though he hadn't just shattered her world. As he left the room, Serafina curled into herself, trembling. She had lost her name, her body, her freedom. But as she lay there, staring at the golden morning light, she made a silent vow. He may have taken everything from her, but he would never take her soul. Serafina Lockwood awoke to silence. The air in the room was still, the dim morning light seeping through the thick curtains, casting golden streaks across the tangled sheets. The world outside was beginning to stir, birds singing, the distant hum of a city coming to life. But inside this vast bedroom, time felt suspended. trapped in the aftermath of what had happened the night before. She shifted slightly, her body aching in ways she had never experienced before. The scent of him lingered on her skin, a cruel reminder of what she had become. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to forget, to erase every moment that had led to this. But she couldn't, because forgetting meant pretending it hadn't happened. Pretending that she hadn't laid beneath Lucian Thorn, hadn't felt the weight of him pressing her into the mattress, hadn't heard her own voice betray her, whispering sounds she had no right to make. Serafina clenched the sheets tighter around her, as if wrapping herself in the fabric could somehow shield her from the truth. She had spent her entire life preparing to be the perfect wife, dutiful, obedient, untouchable until marriage. And yet, in one night, all of it had been stripped from her. She should hate him. She did hate him. So why was her heart still racing at the memory of his hands on her skin? The door creaked open. Serafina's body tensed instantly, her breath hitching in her throat. She didn't need to look to know who it was. His presence filled the room before he even spoke. Lucian Thorn. He walked in slowly, exuding the same unshaken dominance he always carried, as if the entire world existed simply to bend to his will. His dark hair was still damp from a shower, his crisp black shirt undone at the collar, revealing the hard lines of his chest. He looked refreshed, composed, as if the night before had meant nothing to him. Serafina swallowed the lump in her throat and forced herself to sit up. "Get out," Lucian smirked. "Good morning to you too, wife." Her stomach twisted at the word. "You." Her voice cracked, and she hated herself for it. She squared her shoulders, gripping the sheets tightly as she glared at him. "You forced me." Lucian's smirk didn't falter. If anything, it deepened, his gray eyes darkening with something unreadable. He took slow, deliberate steps toward the bed, his gaze locked onto hers like a predator watching its prey. "Forced you?" he repeated, his voice dangerously low. "Tell me, Serafina, is that the lie you're going to come from? Imbana you're going to comfort yourself with?" She flinched as he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Her skin burned where his fingers lingered, and she hated the way her body reacted. "You didn't fight me," he murmured. "You didn't scream. You didn't push me away." Serafina's breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. "Because I knew it wouldn't change anything," she snapped, but the words sounded weak even to her own ears. Lucian chuckled softly, his hand trailing down her arm, his touch sending shivers across her skin. "No," he said simply. "That's not why." Her heart pounded as he leaned in, his lips just inches from her ear. "You wanted it," he whispered. Serafina's entire body went rigid. "You're wrong," she forced out, shaking her head, but her voice lacked conviction. Lucian pulled back just enough to meet her gaze, his steel-like eyes holding her captive. "Am I?" She opened her mouth, ready to throw a sharp retort at him, but no words came, because she didn't know how to fight this. Because the worst part was, he wasn't wrong. Her betrayal wasn't just his doing, it was her own. Her own body had welcomed him, responded to him, craved something she had spent her entire life being taught to deny, and that realization, more than anything else, terrified her. Lucian exhaled, his smirk softening just a fraction. "You're my wife, Serafina. You belong to me." She snapped out of her haze, fury surging through her veins. She shoved his hand away, glaring at him with a fire that burned hotter than her shame. "I belong to no one," she spat. Lucian's smirk returned, full of dark amusement. "Keep telling yourself that, wife. But we both know the truth now." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving her there, trembling with anger and something far worse, something she refused to name. The door shut behind him with a quiet click, sealing her inside the aftermath of her own terrifying realization. Serafina Lockwood had always believed she was untouchable. Now she wasn't sure she even knew who she was anymore. Serafina Lockwood had expected cruelty. She had braced herself for a life of cold detachment, of unrelenting dominance, of becoming nothing more than an ornament in Lucian Thorn's world, a possession to be displayed, controlled, and discarded at his leisure. And yet, what she had not expected, what unsettled her more than anything, was his kindness. Not the grand, sweeping gestures of a man trying to impress his new wife. No, Lucian was not the kind of man who showered women with empty romance. His kindness was something quieter, something insidious in its subtleness, so small and deliberate that it crept into her defenses before she even realized it. The first time she noticed it, she had been sitting at the long dining table, untouched food before her. Lucian had barely spoken, absorbed in the morning's news, but when he set his coffee down, he had glanced at her plate, then at her. "You don't like eggs," he murmured. Serafina blinked, startled. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, one she had never told him. She had hated eggs since childhood, but no one had ever cared enough to notice. Before she could respond, he lifted his hand, gesturing to a servant. "Bring her something else." And just like that, the eggs were gone. It should have meant nothing. It was such a small thing. And yet, that single moment lodged itself deep inside her, twisting through her carefully built walls. Because Lucian noticed. The next time, it was the tea. Serafina had spent the past few days locked in a silent battle with herself, trying to regain some sense of control over her life, refusing to acknowledge the strange, unwelcome way her body responded to him. She had resigned herself to simply existing within these walls, keeping her head down, keeping her heart guarded. But one evening, as she sat curled up in a chair in the library, trying to escape into the pages of a book, a small steaming cup was placed on the table beside her. She looked up in surprise. Lucian stood there, watching her with unreadable eyes. "I notice you never drink the tea the staff brings you," he said simply. Serafina frowned. "What?" "You like it with honey, not sugar," he continued, as if this were just another business acquisition, another fact he had committed to memory. "And only a little milk." She stared at him, the weight of his words pressing against something deep inside her. She faltered, unsure how to respond. Lucian sighed, shaking his head. "Drink it before it gets cold." And then, just like that, he left. She should have ignored it, should have seen it for what it was, a manipulation, a tactic to lower her guard. And yet, as she lifted the cup to her lips, the taste of perfectly brewed tea filled her mouth, and her hands trembled. Because no one, not her father, not the people who had raised her, not even the servants who had waited on her for years, had ever thought to ask how she liked her tea. But Lucian knew. The moments kept adding up. When they walked through the garden, he positioned himself on the side where the wind blew the strongest, shielding her from the chill. When she grew tired at night, too exhausted from the weight of her new life, he pulled her into his lap without a word, massaging her feet with careful, measured movements, pressing a silent kiss against her temple before carrying her to bed. When she fell ill one night, her body trembling with fever, Lucian stayed by her side, pressing cool cloths to her skin, his grip firm and protective, as if her smallest pain was something he could not bear. Serafina should have hated him for it, should have resented him, but instead she found herself drowning in something she did not understand. Lucian Thorne had taken everything from her name, her body, her freedom, and yet he had given her something no one else ever had. He saw her, and that, more than anything, was the most dangerous thing of all. Serafina Lockwood had spent weeks trapped inside Lucian Thorne's world, bound by marriage, duty, and an unspoken war between them. He was both captor and protector, a man who commanded with silence, possessed with careful hands, and watched her with an intensity that burned through her defenses. She had fought against him at first, resisting the pull, clinging to the remnants of the life she once knew. But Lucian was not the kind of man who let go. And now, lying in bed, her body weak with fever, she realized something far more terrifying. She didn't want him to let go. Serafina felt the heat suffocating her skin slick with sweat, her breath shallow. The fever had taken hold quickly, dragging her into a haze where reality blurred at the edges. She wasn't sure when she had last been awake, how much time had passed, or even if she was dreaming. But one thing remained constant. Lucian. He was there, always there, sitting beside her bed, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his expression unreadable but unshaken. Each time she surfaced from unconsciousness, she felt his presence, his steady hands pressing cool cloths to her forehead, his deep voice murmuring words she couldn't understand, his fingers brushing strands of damp hair away from her face. Serafina had never been cared for like this, not by her father, not by anyone. And that realization clutched at her heart with brutal force. Lucian Thorne, the man who had stolen her freedom, was the only one who had ever stayed. The fever dreams came and went, pulling her under, letting her rise. She thought she heard his voice, low and commanding, cutting through the darkness. Drink. Something cold touched her lips, a glass pressed to her mouth. Serafina tried to turn away, but Lucian's hand was there, steady, firm. Serafina, drink. She obeyed. Because despite everything, despite the war inside her, she trusted him. It wasn't until the fever finally broke that she saw him as he was, exhausted. Lucian sat beside her, head bowed slightly, fingers pinching the bridge of his nose, as if he were battling something unseen. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair slightly disheveled. He had stayed awake for her. Serafina swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. You didn't have to. Lucian's head lifted, and his gaze met hers. There was something raw in his expression, something unfamiliar. I did. His voice was hoarse, edged with something she couldn't name. Serafina inhaled slowly, watching him, her heart twisting in a way she wasn't ready to face. He had taken everything from her, her name, her future, her body. But now, as she lay there, weak and fragile, she realized something that shattered her more than all of it. Lucian Thorne needed her, not as a possession, not as a conquest, but as something more. And that was far more dangerous than anything he had done to her before. It wasn't long after she recovered that the letter came. The past arrived in the form of a white envelope sealed with the crest of the Lockwood name. It sat untouched on her nightstand for hours before she finally dared to open it. Her father's words were carefully written, as always, each line precise, void of warmth. Come home. I have made arrangements. This marriage does not have to be permanent. Serafina's blood ran cold. He wanted her back. As if she were a misplaced object. As if she were something he could simply reclaim. Her hands trembled as she folded the letter, placing it neatly on the nightstand. She already knew what her father wanted. To undo the deal. To erase the past. To take back what he had lost. But Serafina was no longer something to be traded. And she was done being controlled. Lucian read the letter in silence, his face unreadable, as his fingers tightened around the paper. Finally he spoke, his voice like steel. You're not going back. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a discussion. Serafina lifted her chin. It's my decision. Lucian's jaw clenched, his gray eyes darkening. Your father sees you as nothing more than a pawn. Do you think he cares what you want? Serafina swallowed. And what about you, Lucian? Do you care what I want? He was silent for a moment, something flickering in his gaze. Then quietly he said, yes. It was the first time he had ever admitted it. The room felt heavier, the air between them thick with something unspoken. Serafina inhaled deeply, grounding herself. I won't be passed between you two like a prize. Lucian exhaled, shaking his head, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Then what do you want, Serafina? She met his gaze, her heart pounding. I want to be free. His face was blank, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers curled into fists at his sides. Finally, he stepped closer, his voice quiet but unyielding. And if I let you go? Serafina's breath caught. If he let her go, she searched his face, seeing something there she had never noticed before. Fear, not of losing power, not of losing control, fear of losing her. Her throat tightened. Would you? Lucian was silent, and in that silence she had her answer. He wouldn't, because he couldn't. Serafina turned away. She knew what she had to do. That night, when the house was silent, she left. No guard stopped her, no alarm sounded, and Lucian, who always knew everything, who was always one step ahead, led her. For the first time in her life, Serafina Lockwood walked away by her own choice. She did not know where she was going. She did not know what the future held, but for the first time she belonged to herself. Lucian Thorne had never begged for anything in his life. He had built his empire through sheer will and ruthless ambition, never needing permission, never asking for anything he could not take. He commanded, and the world obeyed. That was the way it had always been, until Serafina Lockwood walked away. The moment he stepped into the empty bedroom, the truth hit him like a violent storm. The closet door was ajar, the few dresses he had ordered for her still hanging untouched. The jewelry box he had given her, filled with glittering diamonds she had never once worn, sat undisturbed. It was as if she had never belonged here at all. And yet, she had. She had filled these cold walls with something he had never known. Fire, defiance, something wild and untamed. She had challenged him, forced him to see beyond his own selfish world, and now she was gone. Lucian clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He had underestimated her. He had thought she would stay. That despite her resistance, despite her hatred, she would never leave him. He had been wrong. Serafina had left. And worse, she had made the choice herself. For the first time in his life, Lucian Thorne felt something dangerously close to fear, and he could not let it end like this. It didn't take long to find her. He remembered the way her voice had softened just once when she spoke of the lavender fields outside the city, a place where she had always dreamed of going, of standing beneath the open sky, of feeling the wind against her skin without walls to contain her. Lucian had never cared for places like that, until now, because now it was the only place in the world that mattered. His car pulled up along the dirt road, the golden hues of the setting sun stretching across endless waves of violet. But his eyes saw only her. Serafina stood in the middle of the field, her arms wrapped around herself, her long hair dancing in the wind. She looked so small, so lost, yet more powerful than ever before. Because for the first time, she was standing exactly where she had chosen to be. Lucian stepped out of the car, his heart pounding. He had never hesitated before, never questioned his next move. But as he took slow steps toward her, something uncertain clawed at his chest. What if she refused him? What if she was already too far gone? Serafina did not turn around as he approached, but she knew he was there. The air between them was thick, charged with everything that had been left unsaid. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Why did you come looking for me, Lucian?" He exhaled sharply, his fingers flexing at his sides. "Because you're not just a transaction, Serafina." She closed her eyes, her face unreadable. "That's all I ever was to you." Lucian took another step forward. "No," he murmured, "not anymore." She turned to face him then, her green eyes burning with something fierce, anger, sorrow, and something far more dangerous. "Hope." "Then prove it," she whispered. "Not with words, not with power. Prove it with the way you choose to love me." Lucian's breath caught. Love. The word had never held weight in his world. It had never been something he considered necessary, let alone something he needed. But as he stood there, looking at the only person who had ever truly seen him, he realized something terrifying. He had already fallen. Lucian stepped closer, slowly, carefully, as if any sudden movement would make her disappear. Then, without hesitation, he did the one thing he had never done before. He dropped to his knees before her. Serafina inhaled sharply, her lips parting in shock. "Lucian, I don't know how to love you the way you deserve," he admitted, his voice raw, unsteady, "but I know I can't exist without you." The man who had never bowed to anyone was kneeling at her feet, his entire world hanging in the balance. Serafina stared down at him, something breaking inside her. This was not the Lucian Thorne she had known. This was not the cold, untouchable man who had taken her as his wife without a second thought. This was a man trembling at the edge of losing her, and he was afraid. Serafina swallowed hard. "Love isn't about control, Lucian. It isn't about power. It's about choice." Lucian exhaled, his grip tightening at his sides. "Then choose me." Her breath caught. The words were so simple, yet they held the weight of everything they had been through. Could she trust him? Could she believe that the man kneeling before her was not just the ruthless businessman, the man who had claimed her without permission, but someone more? The answer was already there, lingering in the space between them. Serafina knelt down beside him, her fingers brushing against his face, her touch gentle yet firm. "If you want me," she whispered, "then fight for me. Not with force, not with power, but by becoming the man I deserve." Lucian's throat tightened. He had spent his life winning battles through dominance, through strategy, through making sure he was always one step ahead. But this was the first time he had ever been asked to surrender. And as Serafina looked at him, waiting, demanding nothing less than his very soul, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would do whatever it took to keep her, even if it meant becoming something more than the monster he had always been. Serafina Lockwood had spent most of her life being told where to stand, what to say, how to behave. She had been raised to be quiet, to obey, to accept that love was not something she was meant to seek, but something that would be decided for her. And for so long she had believed that, until Lucian Thorne, until a man who had taken her as his own without permission, without love, and yet, somehow, without warning, had become the only person in the world who saw her. Now, standing in the center of the Grand Estate's foyer, Serafina felt the weight of everything pressing down on her as her father's lawyer stood before her, waiting for her decision. Lucian stood just behind her, silent. He had not tried to stop them from coming. He had not thrown threats, had not used his power to make them disappear. No, instead, he had done the one thing she had never expected him to do. He had given her the choice. For once in her life, she had power over herself. Her father's lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his cuffs, his voice smooth but cold. "Your father has made arrangements, Serafina. You can leave with us now. This marriage does not have to be binding." The words were easy, too easy, as if the past few months of her life could simply be erased by a signature on a legal document, as if what had happened between her and Lucian had meant nothing. Lucian remained still, his face unreadable. He would not beg her to stay. He would not demand. He had fought for her in every way a man like him knew how, through dominance, through possession, through the slow, terrifying unraveling of his own carefully built walls. But now he was leaving the fight in her hands. Serafina inhaled deeply, turning her gaze to the man who had once been her entire world. Her father. The man who had molded her into something fragile, something usable. And when his world had crumbled, he had given her away to save himself. She had spent so long believing that she had no choice, that she belonged to him, that her duty as a daughter would always outweigh the desires of her heart. But standing here, feeling the weight of Lucian's presence just behind her, not commanding, not controlling, but waiting, she knew the truth. She had never belonged to her father, and she would never again belong to anyone but herself. Serafina took a slow step back, and then another, until she was standing beside Lucian. The silence in the room was deafening. The lawyer's brows furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. "Miss Lockwood?" "No," she interrupted, her voice stronger than it had ever been before. She lifted her chin, her gaze unwavering. "It's Mrs. Thorne." Lucian inhaled sharply beside her. The words felt like a weight lifted off her chest. For the first time in her life, Serafina Lockwood had made a decision that was hers, and hers alone. The lawyer hesitated, then adjusted his tie, his expression unreadable. "Your father will not be pleased." Serafina's fingers curled at her sides. For so long, that single truth had dictated her every move. But now, she didn't care. "Then he will have to live with it," she said firmly. A long pause followed, thick with tension. Then finally the lawyer inclined his head slightly. "Very well." And just like that, they turned and left. Serafina exhaled shakily, her body still tense, as though she were waiting for something, waiting for the weight of her decision to crash down on her, waiting for regret to settle into her bones, but it didn't come. Instead, Lucian's hand was suddenly at the small of her back, warm and grounding. She turned to him, her breath catching as she met his gaze. Something in his eyes had changed. This was not victory. This was something deeper, something neither of them knew how to name. Lucian had never asked her to stay. He had never tried to own her this time, and still she had chosen him. He exhaled slowly, his voice rough with emotion. "You're sure?" Serafina swallowed past the lump in her throat. "Yes." Lucian searched her face, his jaw tightening slightly, as though he still couldn't believe it. "Serafina." But before he could finish, she did the one thing she had never done before. She reached for him. She lifted onto her toes and pressed her lips against his, her hands fisting in his shirt, her body trembling with everything she could not say. Lucian inhaled sharply, freezing for a moment. Then, with a low, shuddering exhale, he melted into her. His arms wrapped around her, crushing her against him, as if she were something sacred, something he could not let slip through his fingers again. This was not possession. This was not power. This was love, and it was terrifying. When they finally pulled away, Lucian pressed his forehead against hers. his breaths unsteady. "You could have left," he whispered. "You could have walked away." Serafina closed her eyes, her fingers tightening in his shirt. "I know," she murmured, "but I didn't." Lucian let out a broken chuckle, his grip tightening. "You're going to be the death of me, wife." Serafina smiled, her heart pounding. "Then at least you'll die knowing I chose you." Lucian exhaled sharply, his arms wrapping around her as he pulled her closer. For the first time in his life, Lucian Thorne had won a battle not through force, not through strategy, but through surrender. And for the first time in her life, Serafina Lockwood had found something she had never dared to dream of. Freedom, not in running, not in escaping, but in choosing who she belonged to, and most of all, choosing herself. Eleanor Thorne had never expected to see her father again, not after he had given her away, not after he had sold her into a marriage without love, without choice, as if she were nothing more than a bargaining chip to save his crumbling empire. And yet, on a quiet afternoon with the scent of lavender drifting through the open windows and the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the floor, she saw him. Senator Alexander Lockwood stood at the gates of the estate, the man who had once commanded the attention of nations now looking small beneath the weight of his own mistakes. His hair had more gray than she remembered, his shoulders slightly hunched, his sharp, calculating gaze replaced by something she had never seen before. Regret. Lucian was beside her in an instant, his presence a shield of unwavering strength. His grip tightened at her waist as he followed her gaze, his jaw clenching at the sight of the man who had discarded her. "You don't have to see him," Lucian said, his voice cold, final. "I can send him away." Eleanor should have agreed. She should have turned her back, let the past remain buried, let the man who had never once put her happiness above his ambitions suffer in the silence he had created for himself. But instead, she whispered, "Let him in." Lucian hesitated, his grip tightening for a fraction of a second before he exhaled and nodded. He would never understand her softness, her need for closure, but he would honor it, because that was what love truly was. As the gates opened, Eleanor stepped forward, her heart a wild storm against her ribs. She had faced Lucian's wrath, had endured the torment of being a prisoner in her own marriage, had fought for her freedom and won. But this was the hardest battle of all. Her father stopped a few feet away, his gaze searching hers, looking for something he had no right to ask for. "Eleanor," he said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. She did not respond right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch between them, let him feel the weight of everything he had done. "I wasn't sure you would see me," he admitted, shifting uneasily. "I wasn't sure I would either," she answered honestly. A heavy sigh escaped him as he ran a hand down his face. He faltered as if the words caught in his throat, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I was wrong." Eleanor swallowed. The words should have satisfied something inside her, but they didn't, because apologies did not erase wounds. Her father took a slow step closer, his expression raw in a way she had never seen before. "I told myself I was doing what was best, that giving you to Lucian would secure your future, that you would be safe." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "But the truth is, I wasn't thinking about you. I was thinking about myself, about my reputation, my power. And in doing so, I failed you in the worst way possible." Eleanor clenched her fists, a sharp ache building in her chest. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he continued. "I don't even know if I deserve to be standing here asking for it. But I needed to tell you, I regret it. I regret all of it." A lump formed in Eleanor's throat. This was the man she had spent her entire life trying to please. The man whose approval had been her guiding force, whose ambition had stolen every choice she had ever wanted to make for herself. And now here he was, looking at her not as an asset, not as a burden, but as his daughter. Eleanor inhaled shakily. "I hated you for what you did." Her father closed his eyes for a moment, nodding as if he had expected the words but still felt their sting. "I spent nights wondering what I had done to deserve being discarded like that. I thought I was nothing to you." Her voice wavered, but she did not look away. "And yet, despite it all, I still wanted to believe that you loved me." Her father took another step forward, his eyes glistening. "I do," he whispered. "I always have." A tear slipped down Eleanor's cheek before she could stop it. She had every reason to turn away, to let him live in the misery of his choices. But she had learned something in the months since marrying Lucian. Hate was easy, but love, even the broken, painful kind, was a choice, and so she made hers. Slowly, hesitantly, she stepped forward, and then for the first time in years, she wrapped her arms around her father. He stiffened at first, startled, but then he sank into the embrace, his shoulders trembling as he clung to her like a man drowning. "I'm sorry," he murmured into her hair. "I am so, so sorry." Eleanor closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. "The past is done," she whispered. "But if you wanted to be in my life, if you truly mean what you say, then be here now. Not as a senator, not as a businessman, but as my father." Her father pulled back, nodding fervently, his hands gripping hers. "I will. I swear it." Behind her, Lucian remained still, watching, waiting. He had never known the softness of family, the ache of wanting something that had always been just out of reach. But now, seeing Eleanor stand there, healing in the arms of the man who had once betrayed her, he realized something. This was what strength truly was. Not power, not control, but the ability to choose love, even when pain had made it so much easier to walk away. And as Eleanor turned back to him, a new kind of peace settling over her. Lucian knew he would stand beside her, no matter what came next, because she had chosen him, and he would choose her, over and over again. The lavender fields stretched endlessly beneath the golden hues of the setting sun, waves of violet swaying gently in the evening breeze. The air was thick with the scent of flowers, warm and familiar, wrapping around Eleanor Thorne like a long-forgotten lullaby. She stood at the edge of it all, her heart full, her past a distant echo. Beside her, Lucian stood tall, his hand intertwined with hers, his grip strong yet gentle, just as it had always been since the day she chose to stay. The years had softened him in ways neither of them had expected. There was no longer a need for unspoken battles, no more walls between them, because love, real love, had broken them both apart, only to put them back together again. Ahead of them, two small figures ran through the fields, laughter ringing through the air like the sweetest melody. Their children, a boy and a girl, twins, chased butterflies with boundless energy, their giggles lighting up the evening sky. Eleanor's lips curled into a soft smile as she watched them, the very embodiment of love, born from something that had once been built on pain and uncertainty. She had never imagined this life, never thought that the girl who had once been trapped in a cage of duty and sacrifice would one day be standing here, free in every way that mattered. And yet, she was. Lucian turned his gaze toward her, his steel-gray eyes softer than they had ever been in the past. He reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm, as if he already knew the answer. Eleanor exhaled, tilting her head up to meet his gaze. There was no hesitation, no fear, no doubt. "Yes," she whispered. "I've never been happier." Lucian's grip on her hand tightened, and for a moment the world felt as if it had shrunk to just the two of them. This man who had once been her captor, her enemy, was now the love of her life, the father of her children, the only person in the world who had ever truly known her. He leaned down, pressing a slow, reverent kiss to her forehead. "You saved me, you know," he murmured. Eleanor let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "You saved yourself, Lucian. I just didn't leave before you could figure it out." His smirk returned, something she had come to adore over the years. "And I'm grateful for that." A comfortable silence settled between them as they turned their attention back to their children. The twins had managed to catch a butterfly, their tiny hands careful as they marveled at its delicate wings. Eleanor felt her chest tighten with emotion. This was everything she had never dared to dream of. Later that evening, as the sky deepened into shades of indigo and gold, they returned home. The estate that had once felt like a prison was now something entirely different. A place filled with warmth, with love, with life. Eleanor tucked the children into bed, pressing a kiss to their foreheads as they sleepily clung to her, their tiny hands wrapped around her fingers. Lucian leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching them with something unreadable in his gaze. When she finally stepped away, closing the door behind her, she turned to find him still staring, lost in thought. "What is it?" she asked, tilting her head. Lucian hesitated before shaking his head, a slow smile tugging at his lips. "Nothing," he murmured. "I just never thought I'd have this." Eleanor stepped forward, wrapping her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek against his chest. His heart beat steadily beneath her ear, grounding her. "Will you do?" she whispered. "And I'm not going anywhere." Lucian rested his chin atop her head, his grip tightening around her. "I know." And in that moment, Eleanor realized this was not the end of their story. It was just the beginning. Lessons from the story. Eleanor's journey is proof that life does not always follow the path we expect. She was raised to believe that love was something arranged, controlled, dictated by duty. But in the end, she learned that love, true love, cannot be forced. It cannot be bought or taken. It must be chosen. Lucian's transformation was not just about winning Eleanor's heart. It was about earning it. It was about understanding that love is not about control, but about trust. It is about showing up, proving through actions, not just words, that someone is worth fighting for. Together, they prove that even the most broken people can heal, that even relationships born from darkness can find light, that love is not about power, it is about surrendering to something greater than oneself. And for anyone listening to this story, remember, you are not bound by your past. You are not trapped by the mistakes or by the mistakes of those who came before you. You are free to choose your own destiny, to decide who you love, and to demand a love that is built on respect, patience, and unwavering devotion. No matter how impossible happiness may seem, no matter how far you have fallen, remember, there is always a way forward. Eleanor found hers, and so can you. Do you believe in second chances? Do you think true love can grow in the most unexpected places? Comment below to support Eleanor and Lucian's journey. Share your thoughts on their transformation and what this story means to you. Like this story if you believe in love that is freely chosen, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional, powerful, and inspiring stories. This is not the end, because love, real love, always finds a way.